All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this event. My name is David Fields, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which we affectionately call CEAS, so C-E-A-S. And welcome to this fourth event in what we call the CEAS Professional Series. So we conceived of this series all the way back in fall of 2019 as a way to bring to campus individuals who do significant work in East Asian studies, but who do so outside the context of a university. Not that there's anything wrong with universities at all. We love universities. It's just that we hope this series will highlight the authors, the journalists, the filmmakers, and the policymakers who do significant work in East Asian studies and the bridging connections between East Asia and the United States, but who do so primarily outside the bounds of an academic community. And we also use this series to inform our students of the variety of careers and opportunities that they can pursue with their credentials in East Asian studies. So we're so delighted that our speaker today has been willing to spend so much time with students and through different events while she's been here on campus, including an event with our Peace Corps recruiting office tomorrow at 10:30 in Bascom 53. So any students who are interested in the Peace Corps, please attend that event. Before I forget, I would like also to thank the East Asian Legal Studies Center and John Onosorg, the Robert La Follette School of Public Affairs, and then also the Tommy G. Thompson Center for Public Leadership for co-sponsoring this event. So it's a true honor to welcome Ambassador Kathleen Stephens to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Ambassador Stephens was a career diplomat in the United States Foreign Service from 1978 to 2015. She was U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2008 to 2011, the first woman and the first Korean speaker to serve in that position. Other assignments for Ambassador Stephens included China, the Republic of Korea, Yugoslavia, Portugal, Northern Ireland, where she was consul at Belfast during the negotiations that culminated in the Good Friday Agreement. And then finally, she was the American Chargé d'Affaires in India from 2014 to 2015. In addition to these foreign service postings, Ambassador Stephens has also held a number of very important policy positions in Washington, D.C., both at the State Department and at the White House. And these include Under Secretary of State for Public Affairs, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, and National Security Director for European Affairs at the Clinton White House. So it's a true honor to have Ambassador Stephens here, not just because she's had such a long career as a diplomat, but because her career as a diplomat was so successful. And I think one needs to have lived in South Korea or speak a little bit of Korean to just fully appreciate how successful Ambassador Stephens was as an American representative in Korea, since many of her successes are not the things that are at the top of a diplomatic resume. So for example, her resume indicates that she speaks Korean as one of her foreign service languages, but it doesn't say that she frequently gave and gives interviews in Korean, okay? And you can see her doing this on YouTube, something that no American ambassador had ever done before and something no American ambassador has done since who was not already a heritage speaker of Korean. And what is remarkable about these interviews is not her perfect Korean, because as she will readily attest, her Korean is not quite perfect, but rather the passion and dedication and respect for Korean culture that she showed by learning Korean and using it in public. And these interviews were so successful, not just because they were in Korean, but because their focus was not the technicalities of policy or diplomacy, but Ambassador Stephens' own personal experiences with Korean culture, starting as a Peace Corps volunteer at Yesan Middle School in 1975. Her story of learning to speak Korean, eat Korean food, and navigate Korean society mirrored South Korea's own development path from an underdeveloped authoritarian state in the 1970s to a vibrant and prosperous democracy. Her diplomatic resume also does not include how she used her passion for cycling as a way to connect with Koreans outside of Seoul and also to see the country from a different point of view. According to the Donga-ilbo, Ambassador Stephens was the first non-Korean to ride the Four Rivers bike path, which traverses Yarrow for hundreds of kilometers. So it was for all these reasons and many more that a 2011 요성동아 article introduced her as 한국인보다도 한국을 사랑하는 미국 대사. That is, the American ambassador who loves Korea more than the Koreans. As a historian of U.S.-Korean relations, I am quite confident that such words were never spoken of an American diplomat in Korea before Ambassador Stephens. And if all this was not enough, there's one other reason why I'm so excited to welcome Ambassador Stephens to the University of Wisconsin. Ambassador Stephens was born in West Texas, raised in Arizona, and has long-standing connections to Montana, okay? All flyover country, all right? This is flyover country. She did her undergraduate education at Prescott College, a small college in Prescott, Arizona, that went bankrupt the year after she graduated, okay? She says it was a great school, and it did end up coming back. But I mention all of this just to highlight that her path to the highest levels of American diplomacy and foreign policy did not start from the bastions of privilege, nor did it start from the American ivory towers. She did later get an MA from Harvard, but we won't think about that just now. Her path started in flyover country, although she told me she actually prefers the term frontier, which is not, which is fine, especially considering that the frontier thesis was something that Frederick Jackson Turner pioneered here at the University of Wisconsin. But her path started in the frontier or flyover country, led through the Peace Corps. And I would like to point out that that is a path that is open to every student here at the University of Wisconsin, at this university in the middle of flyover country. So Ambassador Stephens' career shows that being from the frontier is no barrier to entering a career in U.S. foreign policy. In fact, I think many of the most influential thinkers in American foreign policy have come from places like these. So just to name a few, Paul Reinsch, Tyler Dennett, Stanley Hornbeck, George Kennan, and Linda Thomas Greenfield, the current U.S. ambassador to the UN, were all born and educated, or born or educated here at the University of Wisconsin. And it is my hope that we are educating the next generation of leaders in American foreign policy and many other fields at the University of Wisconsin today. And finally, and I'll be done, I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Stephens to learn her thoughts on the future of American diplomacy in Asia. So these are unsettling times that we live in, more than at any point during my lifetime anyway. The future seems filled with foreboding possibilities in international affairs. Everything from peaceful coexistence to another world war seems possible in the next few decades. Just how this future unfolds, of course, is uncertain, but there is no doubt that American diplomacy in Asia will be an important factor. And we are so fortunate to have someone of Ambassador Stephens' long experience and deep understanding to help us explore this topic today. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Kathleen Stephens.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And David, wow, thank you. That was a scarily well-researched and very, very generous introduction. I wasn't going to do this, but I'm already going to digress slightly because I have to respond and say, first of all, I don't consider Wisconsin to be flyover country, even though I've only ever driven through it or flown over it. But I'm really glad to be here for my first visit to Madison. I do consider it the heartland, and I also want to assure people between meeting lots of students and faculty and community members over the last few days, and thank you so much to David and his colleague Lori Daniels for a terrific schedule. I've had a chance to buy a lot of cheese, to see the state capitol, to drink one glass of Spotted Cow beer, and to have a bowl of suntubu jjigae in the shadow of your beautiful capital. So that means that my high expectations of Madison have already been exceeded. Your reputation is certainly something I know, and especially one thing, given David, and I appreciate it, his attention to the importance of foreign language to many careers, but certainly one where we're trying to communicate, persuade, negotiate, understand people with very different perspectives and backgrounds. It's very, very hard to think about doing that without at least attempting the language and also eating the food. So that's a little easier usually. And I have one, and this is where I'm going to digress. Well, I'm already digressing slightly. So, and this is a group I hope we can have a conversation. And I've been talking about Korea, and tomorrow, if you want to hear more Peace Corps stories, I'll try to save most of those for tomorrow. But concentrate on a few other things today. But happy to talk about them. But you mentioned that when I used my Korean. Unfortunately, I went to Korea just as kind of social media was really getting big, so that does mean so many things live on YouTube that otherwise would be sort of, relegated to the dustbin of forgottenness. But one memorable of many, many memorable, I have to tell it's not too long into a speech before I have to say when I was ambassador in Korea, but one very memorable day I spent in Korea was a day when I went down to Busan, the city on the southern coast. And this was a place I had actually lived in the 1980s when I had an earlier diplomatic assignment in Korea in the 1980s at the U.S. consulate there. And at that time, there was a U.S. military establishment called Camp Hialeah, one of many dotted across Korea. And it was one that was scheduled for turn over back to the Korean government and to the city of Busan to become a park, something that's going to happen soon in the next few years. Hopefully I'll be around to see it, and Seoul to the much larger area where the U.S. Army and the 8th Army has been since the Korean War. So in any event, this was happening in Busan. And I had worked very hard with the mayor of Busan to work with the central bureaucracy in Korea, with the U.S. military, to try to accelerate what can be a very, very bureaucratic process, as you can imagine, of preparing a large space of land in a city that has very little spare land, to turn it back over to the authorities to get the process of the park underway. So we succeeded, and that's I just thought of it as you were talking about it, and that was all behind-the-scenes diplomacy. It wasn't a public thing. But then the day came to dedicate the park. And so I went down to Busan. There was a crowd. It was a very hot day. There were literally thousands there in this outdoor park for an outdoor ceremony. The Prime Minister of Korea was there. The mayor was there. All of the officials, the people. They toured through. They saw the old American high school where the Busan Panthers used to play basketball games, and talked about how they're going to turn that into a park. In any event, what's my point here, other than that's one example, I guess, of diplomacy that worked? There's a lot of more examples where it doesn't work, or at least it doesn't work that quickly. But I decided, I was asked to give short remarks, and again, rather intimidating, outdoors, buzzing microphone, thousands of people, and I had prepared remarks in Korean. I did what Koreans often do. I decided I was going to read my speech, and so I read a speech in which I did say, I hope this is going to be a model for the kind of cooperation for the further transformation of our footprint, our military footprint in Korea, our work together for a park. I looked forward to come back. So just, niceties. So I made that speech, and it was kind of polite clapping. It was very hot, people fanning. And then I found out a few days later, this is a little bit, Busan Ilbo, the main newspaper in Korea, had put my little speech on their page as a video. And I thought, oh, great, this is going to really bring attention to what I want to. It's going to be, this is a model for how we want to work together on this big project in transforming the U.S.-Korea relationship and alliance and so on. But in Korean, it was all in Korean. At the top, the headline did not say, U.S. ambassador welcomes the transfer of Camp Hialeah to be Busan People's Park. It said, the American ambassador speaks really good Korean. And then all the comments were about, that was really interesting. And so all the comments were, yeah, the Korean's pretty good. It could be better, or maybe she should have said this. But in any event, and that's still up there now I'm telling, and it's gotten like more than 100,000 views, which is nothing compared to like K-pop or something. But for a bureaucrat, that's a lot, But if I had made those remarks in English, exactly the same remarks, I can guarantee you it might have gotten 100 views. So that to me said, even at the risk of huge embarrassment to myself and making a terrible mistake, I once gave a speech in Korean. It was actually at a wedding, and I read the same line twice before I realized it. That was very embarrassing. But you have to risk a little bit, and that was a small risk, and it still gives me pleasure to sort of see, okay, maybe the discussion is about this foreigner who happens to be the American ambassador speaking English. I was speaking Korean, but there was a message out there that reached a lot of people we normally don't reach. So already, I've digressed. But what I want to say is, I'm going to try to talk a little more broadly today. I've taken very seriously the the purpose of this wonderful lecture series of bringing people from outside the academy, outside universities, to bring our perspectives and possibly to provide some insight into career paths. And not necessarily in this case career paths that have to do with Korea or even China, but more broadly U.S. diplomacy, because I would say one of my messages, you should only have a few messages, right? But I probably have more than that. One of my messages is, we need, I'm talking about the United States, but if you're from other countries, I think this applies as well. The United States, we need China hands, Asia hands for the 21st century. But those China hands, Asia hands are also going to have to have a very global perspective. We're operating in a different world now, and we'll talk about that. And in many ways, the Atlantic theater, if you like, and the Pacific theater and the problems have come together, and we need people who have perspectives not only in a broader geographic sense, but also functionally, whether it comes to technology, public health, climate change, science, supply chains, we could go on and on. Anyway, I hope I can encourage that today. And I'm going to tell you, but I'm going to kind of, again, hold off having told you one story on the kind of, personal stories unless you ask me, although I'll probably be tempted. I do want to relay to you that I certainly feel that I had as a young student, a woman from Arizona whose first trip east of the Mississippi River was to Hong Kong. And Hong Kong actually was where I really got my first deep dive into East Asia and U.S., and that was in the 1970s when I was a student there for a year and then stayed on to be an outward bound instructor. And that really set me on the path that then took me to the Peace Corps and then took me into the Foreign Service. That path for me has been one that's been incredibly rich in experience. It's been full of meaning, if not always success. And by success, I mean in terms of our overall objectives, but also ups and downs in terms of sacrifices one makes in one's own life. But it's been a very rich in experience. I can't imagine one really more rich in experience, if not rich in material terms. But that's okay. So I'm going to talk about U.S. foreign policy today and diplomacy, and there's a little bit of a distinction between the two. I want to talk about that, foreign policy and diplomacy, but not from the viewpoint of a scholar or from a theoretical viewpoint, but of a practitioner. And also a practitioner, a generalist, because again, American diplomats, we have a generalist corps. It's only about 8,000 people, which is actually not very many. We always like to say in the Foreign Service there are more musicians in U.S. military bands than there are generalist Foreign Service officers. But we're generalists, and as you can see from my career, not unusual, notwithstanding the fact that I've lived for 11 years in my life in South Korea and worked on it in Washington for others. Having been fortunate to have a long career and pretty long life now, it means a lot of years elsewhere too, doing deep dives into new issues that I was in some ways not at all prepared for, and having to learn to adapt, to bring relevant experience, but also understand the new things I needed to understand. And these are great lessons that I drew from my career and great opportunities I feel I had. But before I even talk about foreign policy or diplomacy, and the distinction between the two, I have to touch on, and David began it, and I'm going to, something that I think I find diplomats especially, and sometimes people in government, and maybe whenever we're kind of briefing someone on what the issue is, you got to set the context, right? You got to set the context. Maybe lawyers do too. And by the way, I should have added, also thanked all the sponsors and supporters of this program today. Forgot about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about context. And I'm talking about context from the point of view, of course, of being someone who, I first went to Asia. It's hard for me to even say this, more than 50 years ago, half a century ago, 1972. And having seen over the course of my life and my career, enormous changes, of course, big hinge moments in history. And East Asia, of course, the ones that stand out to me are the normalization of U.S.-China relations, which happened to occur just a few months after I joined the Foreign Service. I'm not saying there was a relationship between the two, but I subsequently was posted to China to help open the U.S. Consulate General in Guangzhou after it had been closed since the 1940s. To see the beginning of reform and opening in China, a very hopeful time, but also, even at that time, a very challenging time. And then subsequently, of course, to see China's enormous and rapid economic growth, the emergence of hundreds of millions of people. And I know this it's generational and more than generational transformation, hundreds of millions of people from poverty into lives of greater opportunity and education and prosperity. This is something to be celebrated continually. But of course, also more broadly, the end of the Cold War, the splintering of the Soviet Union, the rise of the U.S. as a singular power. When I joined the Foreign Service, I thought the Cold War would last forever. It lasted the first 10 years of my career. But after that, the seeming triumph of U.S. values, U.S. vision for the world, the end of history in the world of one scholar who's never lived it down. I think he's a little unfairly. And then, of course, afterwards, even after the 9/11 attacks, the global war on terror, the sense of the world had changed again. And, I hope you think I'm not prone to exaggeration, but even with all that kind of change, and I haven't mentioned a lot of other things, including the transformation of Korea and Japan and Southeast Asia and so on and so forth, and I will later. Even with all of that, this period we're in now feels exceptional. And I don't mean that in an entirely hopeful way. I mean it in a very serious way. I think we are at an inflection point, a period of great uncertainty, a watershed moment, certainly for the United States, but also for the world. We are in a period of extreme geopolitical flux. The world is on fire. This makes it really hard to give a speech about, just kind of going from the old talking points about what we're doing and how we should go forward. We have to think really, really hard. And I'm out of government now, so I can say what I want, but I'm trying to think hard. And so if I don't make a lot of sense, forgive me. I'm trying to think with you about these challenges. The context of a major hot war in Europe, conflict, humanitarian crisis, the specter of a wider war in the Middle East, an assertive China intimidating its neighbors, flexing its muscles, feeling hemmed in by pressure from the United States, all that leading to a very tense, a very difficult U.S.-China relationship. In many ways, the most difficult relationship between the U.S. and China, I would say, since normalization. One might quibble with that, but I think that's the case. Growing militarization throughout the Indo-Pacific. And maybe we can talk later about the use of the phrase Indo-Pacific as rather than East Asia or East Asia-Pacific and the implications of that. Tensions over Taiwan at the highest point in decades. And all the issues around the economic sphere, supply chains, technological issues, efforts to decouple, de-risk economic dependencies to lessen our technological and economic vulnerabilities and interdependence. And to go to the Korean Peninsula, where there is much good to report, nonetheless, a North Korea increasingly determined, confident, and feeling relatively unconstrained as it seeks to maintain and grow its nuclear weapon and missile delivery arsenal. And in democracies around the world, we were talking a little bit about this earlier, and I'd say including here in the U.S., in a year of many, many elections, a sense of democratic backsliding, of a climate of growing polarization and populism, which seems to infect many, many of our countries. And along with that, international institutions that are under stress and lessening legitimacy and effectiveness. Along with that, this is getting a little grim. I didn't realize I wrote this out. The America in decline narrative, the notion that not only has the unipolar moment of American power passed, but that America's domestic problems will undermine its ability to act reliably or predictably abroad and to keep its many commitments. Alienation on the part of many in what we now call the Global South to the set of priorities that the U.S. has set out. And speaking of a climate of a political climate, I would also speak of climate in terms of climate change, a challenge that obviously demands the deepest kind of international cooperation and coordination. So this is the context. This is the breadth of our foreign policy challenges. And of course, also of domestic policy. So, and of course, it's only a partial listing. But one thing I would kind of underline, and I know there's a lot of things, words float over today, is one observation which may seem obvious, but I think is a relatively recent and phenomenon is, and again, I'm speaking of the United States primarily, I think our foreign policy and domestic policy are increasingly linked. And I'll give you some examples later, but just to preview those, I mean, in things like the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, which are in a way domestic programs, right, of a different kind of economic policy for this country, but with very, very deep foreign policy implications. And I think we're more aware of that. It's more baked into the system. And the time when I could be a diplomat and sort of say, I don't talk about domestic policy, but that's not my deal. I talk about foreign policy. They really are integrated, and this makes it even anything else, complex. And, it also strikes me, I live still in Washington, D.C. when I'm not in Montana or Arizona or Wisconsin, which are much nicer places to be in some ways. But I like Washington, I confess. I'm not going to do the trash Washington thing. But, both in Washington and out, whether you're in foreign policy circles or political circles or just generally, I think there's very limited consensus. In some areas there probably is, but maybe the wrong consensus. But there is a limit on the sort of agreement about the right approach on all these issues. And they are very, very tough. I haven't read it yet, but I confess I'm staying in a hotel here, so I turn on the TV when I'm in my hotel room. And I saw someone I've known for a long time, David Sanger, who's the national security and White House correspondent for the New York Times, and followed the North Korean program very closely over the years, so I got to know him quite well. He has a new book, and it's called The New Cold Wars, and it's two wars. He says there's two Cold Wars, kind of one with Russia, one with China. But that's not the part I'm talking about. The comment he made, which I thought was right, and because he's a kind of a card-carrying member, if you like, of the Washington foreign policy establishment, he said, for 20 or 30 years in Washington, in the U.S., the foreign policy, there was more of a bipartisan, not completely, but a bipartisan agreement, and it was a consensus on the benefits of globalization, of free trade, under the rubric of a U.S.-led, rules-based international order, a belief that the U.S. could continue to lead an order which, over time, China, which was benefiting from it, would inevitably become more of a part. A responsible stakeholder was a word that was used at one point in an international system, and that engagement would work. That all of this, the sort of Washington consensus about that, American consensus about that, has gone away. And what has replaced it? That is the challenge. I don't have great answer to all these challenges. I am going to give you a few more thoughts in just a minute on kind of foreign policy, but now I'm going to turn, because I do want to talk about now what diplomacy, and why I'm kind of carving out diplomacy as something to think about relatedly to foreign policy, but also a little differently. That's kind of getting to the career part of this too, and kind of what practitioners do. I see diplomacy as an instrument of foreign policy. It's how policies get implemented. And so very important, that is, who is doing the implementing? Who does? Because in implementing, you also shape it. And how is that done as the world and the issues become ever more complex? So spoiler alert, I'm going to say a lot of you should be doing this and give you some ideas about maybe, if you're interested, some things you might do, whether you want to become a professional diplomat or an ambassador or something entirely different. But get back to foreign policy for a minute, and again, especially in Asia. Maybe I want to try to paint a little bit of a picture of kind of what that conventional look was and where I think we are now. And of course, when I talk about U.S. relations in Asia, I'm talking about a post-World War II Asia where the U.S. emerged as the most powerful nation. And a post-World War II order shaped largely by the United States in concert with others, thinking, I think, of a shared, not a zero sum, but a shared good. The U.S. took the lead there and set up a set of alliances. NATO, of course, in Europe. I know we're here to talk about Asia, but I think we have to mention NATO, which celebrates its 75th anniversary this year. There's going to be a gathering of all the leaders of the NATO countries in Washington in a couple of months. And Asian leaders are going to be there too, because there's now something called NATO Plus, or NATO Plus 3. Maybe it's more than 3 now. And it's South Korea, Japan, Australia. So a set of alliances, and again, NATO an alliance which after the end of the Cold War there was an actual debate about whether it should even continue to exist. And then, along with that, if it continued to exist, should it expand? And there's one very good book about NATO expansion, which I'd recommend, which is called Not 1 Inch, by a very good scholar from a university I can't remember, but it's not here. It is especially relevant as we try to understand, doesn't tell us the answer, but as we try to understand the context for the rise of Putin and the ongoing dispute, if you like, or more than dispute, over Ukraine and its future. A lot of the background is there and is really helpful in understanding that. But that set of alliances, and of course in Asia, there was not a multilateral alliance. I mean, the architecture, the world didn't allow for that. There was something called CETO, for those of you who have really long memories, which didn't really work out. But there was what came to be known as the hub and spoke system, with the United States being the hub, the spokes being bilateral alliances with Asian partners. And each of those alliances with their own individual characteristics. Japan, where Japan forswore its ability or its right to have a military or a traditional military in exchange for American security guarantees. That, again, is kind of changing now in this world, but a strong alliance with Japan, South Korea in the aftermath of the Korean War, as David knows very, very well from his own scholarship. An alliance with the United States entered very unwillingly, and only as a way of really getting South Korea and its obstreperous president, Syngman Rhee, to acquiesce in a ceasefire and an alliance. And Syngman Rhee insisting that absent a security guarantee in the form of the alliance, of the treaty, that the U.S. might bug out again. So some of these origin stories of these alliances, and last year we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the Korean one, are less than glorious, but they have lasted and deepened and broadened over time, which is a great and positive story, I believe. And of course, more broadly, other alliances with Australia, Philippines, strong partnerships with others, and with the U.S. military as the predominant military in there, providing security in the Asia-Pacific, which I do think helped to ensure the kind of environment that allowed the economic rise, first and foremost, of course, the Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, some of the Southeast Asian countries, and China itself. And along with that, America's policies of open markets, the open U.S. markets, the support for new countries to enter the multilateral institutions, such as the WTO, the World Trade Organization, World Bank participation, and so on. This seemed like a pretty positive thing, and it went pretty well, notwithstanding hot wars in Korea and Vietnam, which at best were stalemate and loss. Nonetheless, the development of relationships the U.S. had with these two countries that have become very positive over time. And of course, I've already mentioned, I think, again, the big one is the normalization of relations with China, along with reform and opening in China, and the burgeoning of the relationship between the U.S. and China in those initial decades. Again, with some pretty serious bumps in the road, but overall, a burgeoning. And there was a real sense over these years that the center of gravity in the world was shifting towards the Pacific. And U.S. policymakers with a political and diplomatic establishment still very devoted to thinking as across the Atlantic, of saying we really need to pay more attention to Asia, setting up more multilateral institutions vis-a-vis that embedded the U.S. in it, and optimistic, I think, optimism on the part not only of Americans but of many of our partners, that with these growing partnerships over time, that countries would draw closer to shared values, shared institutions, and cooperation. I saw a lot of very positive things during this time. I lived in South Korea in the 1970s when it began its extraordinary industrialization and economic rise. I lived again in Korea in the 1980s when it was still under essentially a military authoritarian government for a time when I was there, but was enjoying double-digit growth. That double-digit growth was not enough for the Korean people themselves by the middle of the 1980s, and we saw then a transition to democracy. Democracy that remains, like all democracies, not a perfect one, but one for which the Koreans have never looked back. And of course, as I already mentioned, in those early days in China, I still recall with great affection and emotion, the way that the people-to-people dimension of the relationship. Southern China, with its deep, deep ties to the Chinese community here in the United States, ties that have been cut off for 40 years, and to suddenly be a part of reestablishing those ties, as well as opening up the opportunities for economic growth. These are things that we need to remember as things that we've done together, and that can still, I think, be things that we can appreciate and work on together. But now, of course, it's been more than a decade since U.S.-China relations have taken a turn for the worse. I'm not going to go into a long discussion, although we can, of what I think some of the strains are. I do think that who is in power matters, and with the change of leadership in China in 2012, there was definite changes in the U.S.-China relationship. From the U.S. perspective, China's growing military capability is creating tensions within the neighborhood, the South China Sea, of course, and worries about Taiwan. So the worsening of that environment has led us to get where we are today, and foreign policy today with the Biden administration, in some ways having adopted a foreign policy, in some ways very different from the Trump administration, but in a couple of ways, not so different. So how is it different? Some of the ways it's different is more in tactics, I would say, and maybe that gets into diplomacy of it. Maybe I could say it's more diplomatic, but that's kind of that sort of light use of the word diplomatic. But certainly, if you talk to anybody in the Biden administration, I would say it's from President Biden on down, and they talk about the foreign policy. Within the first 50 words they say, usually the words allies and partners are there. Allies and partners. There's been a real doubling down on, in part to repair what was seen as damage from the previous administration, doubling down on really strengthening those relationships. Particularly with NATO, South Korea, Japan. Said President Biden has hosted 5 state visits, the highest visit that you can have for a foreign leader. 4 have been to Asian leaders, and the other one was France. Our oldest ally, by the way. So it shows the importance not only of allies and partners, I mean in a very symbolic way, but also of Asia. One thing that the Biden administration has continued, and this was actually a continuation not just from the Trump administration, but the Obama administration, is again this use of the concept of the Indo-Pacific, and indeed calling it the free and open Indo-Pacific. And this being the U.S. government, especially if there's military involved, sometimes they even call it FOIP, which is not very nice sounding. But the free and open Indo-Pacific. We can talk more about that later if you'd like. And I think under each administration there's been a different emphasis to it. But to me, it's notably a different concept from even, and I think words matter, than East Asia or East Asia and the Pacific. For it doesn't have the word Asia in it. To me, it implies a more maritime strategy. I think for China, it implies whether a bit of an encirclement or containment strategy. So these words matter. And of course, I think the administration would say, no, it doesn't. But there is a sense of growing militarization on both sides of the Indo-Pacific, and an effort to pull in India, which is not an ally, not a treaty ally of the United States, but a partner that the U.S. has worked hard to draw closer. So the U.S. is really, with the free and open Indo-Pacific, trying to underscore on this idea of a rules-based order and a broader strategy that brings in more countries, but has a bit of a, honestly, I think, a hole in the middle called China policy. Trade. The Biden administration has continued to, I think, pull back from U.S. leadership in the area of trade. In fact, trade is not a word you even hear very often from the Biden administration, even though there still is a U.S. trade representative, USTR. Again, this is something that's carried over from some of the things that seemed rather shocking during President Trump's administration, the use of tariffs in a way by oftentimes unilateral tariffs in ways that had not been done by the United States in a very long time. The withdrawal of the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the free trade agreement that had been negotiated under the Obama administration, although candidate Clinton also backed away from it during the campaign. So speaking of domestic policy, a changing attitude in this country, domestic attitudes about the benefits of globalization, the benefits of U.S. leadership on trade, and a response by successive administrations to pull back from that. And instead, in the case of the Biden administration, to turn towards an industrial policy, something we associate more with Japan, Korea, South Korea, I suppose one could even say China, in terms of the government taking a big role in picking the winners and losers and investing in certain key sectors, turn towards that, with a result also of drawing large investments from allies and like-minded partners to secure supply chains. So quite a change, I think, that's occurred in the approach on Asia over the last decade, and in some ways, it was kind of a bipartisan one. And when it comes to now, and of course, we're at election year, breaking news, right? The foreign policy discussion, I think, that's occurring in this country mostly is kind of tough and tougher. If you're talking about the major political representatives in this country. Again, I noticed just yesterday, President Biden introduced some new tariffs on Chinese, I think, steel and other goods. Mr. Trump is running a campaign this time on imposing 10% tariffs on all global goods, I think it is. This is something we haven't seen in the United States for a long, long time. And, it's in response to real issues, real problems that need to be addressed, in my view, in the United States, and real political challenges for our candidates. But it's sending worries, to say the least, and ripples of concern throughout the world, I think, to both our allies and partners and those who we are more in competition with about the direction of U.S. leadership and of economic policy. And then just to underscore the other major point I want to make in this section is on China policy. I think there still is a real strategic question of what is U.S.-China policy beyond either being really tough or accepting war is somehow inevitable, or thinking that regime change is the only answer. I don't think any of those make good policy or sustainable policy. I do think we're going to have to, unfortunately, wait for the election here in the United States to have a more serious, broader discussion about what a sustainable global order with space for both China and the U.S. to work together where we can, to compete where we must, to work out our differences where we can. That is a conversation we need to have. And it's not too early, and I'm sure some of you here are already thinking about it, it's not too early to start that process now, although, as I said, I'm afraid the rhetoric between now and November is going to be in a fairly narrow bandwidth. So now diplomacy, and what do diplomats? All I can say is I'm really glad I'm not a diplomat right now. But I thought I would just take a minute, and I've already because I do find a lot of people, including people who've already joined the Foreign Service, will say to me, including a lot of my family members who've known me for a long time, and they'll say, "What does a diplomat do? What is it?" I could ask ChatGPT. I didn't do that, but I looked at my generation's version of ChatGPT, which is Encyclopedia Britannica, to say, does this sound like what I've been doing? And I pulled out kind of what I thought it did, and maybe said it in language that's a little clearer than I could say. And Encyclopedia Britannica says, diplomacy is the established method of influencing the decisions and behavior of foreign governments and peoples through dialogue, negotiation, and other measures short of war or violence, right? It's often confused with foreign policy, but it's not synonymous. Diplomacy is the chief, but not only instrument of foreign policy. It is the principal substitute for the use of force, or underhanded means, I think it means spying, in statecraft. And it is how comprehensive national power is applied to the peaceful adjustment of differences between states. And one thing about diplomacy, and I know at least in the U.S. and in English, we sometimes when you say, "Oh, you're being a good diplomat," it means, "Oh, all you know is how to be nice." No, diplomacy can be coercive. The use of economic sanctions is a diplomatic tool. Meeting with your adversaries and threatening to apply punitive measures or even use force is a form of diplomacy. But the goal of diplomacy is to avoid war and to avoid force, And unlike, if you like, foreign policy, where you state your goals publicly, most diplomacy is conducted in confidence, though you can make public what happened. And within, this is me, not Encyclopedia Britannica, within the United States, the Department of State, led by the Secretary of State, leads the implementation of foreign policy. That's why it's the oldest cabinet department in the U.S. government. It's also one of the smallest. It's quite small. And I already mentioned that there's only about 8,000 generalist foreign service officers. If you count a different way and you count support and so on, there's about 13,000. That's just as a means of, I'm not going to compare dollars because that would be even more kind of astonishing, but the U.S. military has 1.3 active duty military and 800,000 reservists. Now, diplomats are not an army, but it's a difference. The Department of Defense and successive military officers I've worked with, and I've worked with ones very, very closely throughout the world, including, of course, especially in Korea, are usually the State Departments and diplomats' biggest cheerleaders, because they always say, your job is to keep us from having to use force. And certainly, if you're an American diplomat, it does give you a certain presence at the table when the people who are sitting across know the kind of military assets that the United States has. These things are not unrelated to being effective. But Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis in 2018, said this to the Congress, actually. They were cutting State Department funds. He says, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition ultimately. So I think there's a cost-benefit ratio. The more that we put into the State Department's diplomacy, the less we have to put into a military budget. You very rarely hear anybody say, don't put more in my budget, but the less we have to put into a military budget as we deal with the outcome of an apparent American withdrawal from the international scene. So that's my little pitch for the State Department. But who are the diplomats? I've talked about FSOs, talk more about that. But in fact, and you really see this enforced when you're a place like Korea, where we have such a huge relationship that goes way, way beyond even our security relationship, deterring North Korea, dealing with kind of the more traditional basket of, if you like, diplomatic and security issues, to cooperation on every front, including people-to-people exchanges, visas, extraditions, drugs, public health, you name it. So nowadays, almost every, notwithstanding the small size of the State Department, almost every American embassy has personnel from other parts of the federal government, and sometimes even outside the federal government. The Department of Agriculture, agricultural exports from the United States, including some from Wisconsin. Like I said, there's Wisconsin cheese, and a lot more after the FTA, you were telling me. Oftentimes, we'll have specific representatives from the Department of Agriculture, of course, Department of Commerce, Department of Interior, Justice, National Institute of Health. It's very striking there was a consulate general in Wuhan in China, right? The origin of the COVID-19. There was a public health officer there from the National Institute of Health assigned to the consulate in Wuhan. Now, that didn't, in the end, make it possible for us to have the kind of transparency and communication that I would have liked to have seen for this terrible pandemic. But I think the fact that we had somebody there said, we know that we need to do this. We know that we need to have people out there who are developing, who have the expertise, including technical expertise, and developing the relationships we need to try to, again, diplomacy about preventing war, but it's also about trying to prevent other bad things from happening. And I hope we can learn a lesson from that and do more rather than less in that kind of specialized diplomatic outreach and work. But we also, I think, state governments are playing an increasing role in not only our trade relationships, especially in the case of Korea, with all the Korean investment, also Japanese investment, also Chinese investment. We see state governors, state secretaries of commerce traveling to the region very often, setting up offices there often. In Korea now, there are numerous states, I don't think Wisconsin is one yet, who have their actual own offices. And in a sense, it's trade diplomacy, it's commercial diplomacy that they're carrying out. Universities. I know your dean, your chancellor is going to Korea in June. There are numerous American universities who have, not only as this university does, enormous alumni groups in Korea and other countries, but also branch campuses and vice versa. Because again, I think, and I may be hopefully speaking to the choir here, I think that students coming back and forth, and we took a big hit during the pandemic, is going to underpin the success of our foreign policy and our diplomacy going forward. Businesses, I would go beyond that to non-government organizations of all kinds, whether they have religious missions, charitable missions, public health missions. It's all part of this increasingly integrated, even in this world where we've been somewhat fragmented international picture. So to wrap up, I just want to say, and see, I haven't talked too much about Korea, but I'm happy to talk more about it, or whatever you want to talk about. U.S. foreign policy, I believe, is at an historic inflection point. I wish I had a stronger word for it. We face enormous challenges, but this is not a cry of despair. The United States does have many strengths, and high among them are our network of allies and partners, many of them sharing our worries about what's happening in the world. And while the world does seem to be on fire just about everywhere, I do think that this notion that we've had for some time within the U.S. government, whether we called it the pivot to Asia or the rebalance to Asia, Indo-Pacific, but the notion that East Asia, the Indo-Pacific, whatever we want to call it, is and will continue to be of increasing importance to not only our overall national security and prosperity, but also remains key partners we need to have to solve the global issues that face us. And that, I think, has to remain a central guiding principle and priority for our foreign policy going forward. But to achieve those goals, in addition to having a broader debate that I've suggested is really happening right now, we need to ensure, and these are related, that we have a breadth, depth, and diversity of practitioners, experts, scholars looking at it, fresh and open minds. Easier said than done sometimes, and that's why I'm here to recruit some of you for that. Yes, the United States, and we're in the heartland, not flyover, but we are cosseted by two great oceans and some wonderful lakes. But withdrawing from the world is not an option. We are right now, and you young people, you're all young to me, are seeing the reshaping of the world that I know, into something different. And again, whatever words we use to describe it, and I think it'll change, a rules-based order or something else, we have to learn from experience. We have to think about what's going to work now, which reflects today's world. And for all that, we do need people who have the language ability, the context of history and culture, and some of the qualities actually who Kaiser Kuo, and the last person who gave a lecture here mentioned, and I enjoyed it, he talked about China policy as well. But he didn't really focus so much on specific policy things, but said what people who work on China need. And then he said, well, there are really no China experts. I remember, now I'm quoting him. He said, there are really no China experts, and he hated it when people called themselves China experts on that. But then he listed people he respected on China. A lot of them were diplomats who were friends of mine, so I was happy about that. But they would never call themselves expert, because he said you need people who have humility. And certainly, you know, I don't consider myself an expert on a country that I lived in for 11 years, where I speak the language. You know, whatever you learn, I know it's true in many fields, you're just aware of how much you don't know. I think we bring that to it. And when it comes to trends in China, what we think we know about China, where I think our communications are most lacking right now, the need is even greater. The need is even greater because the means of communications have become even more constrained than they have been for some time. So let's bring our best, our curiosity, our empathy, our willingness to try to see how others see the world, even though you may not agree it. Sometimes, you know, diplomats are accused sometimes of something called clientitis. You know, if you say, oh, you know, the South Koreans think this and this and this, and you say, well, you've just become too much like the Koreans. No, not necessarily, but, you know, you need to empathize and understand at some level where you can effectively communicate and also respond and make sure that's taken into account. And I think that gets lost, especially in a polarized debate, which unfortunately, especially the U.S.-China debate and some other debates have become. But with all that, I think it's absolutely essential because whatever happens, and you know, I think the U.S. has, on balance, in my view, been a positive contributor to the progress and the the growth that we have seen in the world over my professional lifetime. It certainly hasn't done everything right, but U.S. engagement, leadership, participation in the world, I think continues to be essential not only for our country, but for a world where we can all find a way to deal with the really existential challenges that we face. So I hope that's not too serious, but we're a pretty serious audience. And I really do thank you all for coming today, and I hope we'll have a little bit of time for a conversation.